In facilitation processes, we regularly face conflicts among members of the group, don't we? What can we do to transform such conflicts into productive cooperation? This is our question. In this talk, we will listen about attitudes, approaches, and actions that can help facilitators deal with interpersonal conflicts. Let me read CV for Paul. It's a huge CV. He studied social sciences at Ludwig Maximilians University at Munich and University of Montreal. He initially focused on disclosure theories, international cooperation, and diplomacy. His postgraduate degrees at the Higher School of Economics, Moscow, and University College London. He specialized in conflict studies, public communication, and disclosure analysis. Above all, his academic research made him realize that the world depends on how we deal with each other. After completing his studies, Paul initially worked as a crisis communications consultant and strategic advisor at different communications agencies in Berlin. He was employed as a consultant for public engagement and participation. Subsequently, he has also been working as a conflict moderator and consultant for public dialogue processes and organizational development. Since 2021, he provides his services independently as a facilitator, mediator, consultant, and trainer for better cooperation and less conflict at work. I'm sure he will bring a new angle to our engagement world. And please welcome Paul MC.
Thank you very much, Ishik. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak to you today. As Ishik already mentioned, I am a facilitator and mediator for cooperation conflict at work, and I have a special focus on intercultural cooperation processes. Through these two roles that I have, I realized that facilitation and mediation can to an extent benefit from each other. There are some aspects that are beneficial from mediation that are very useful for a facilitation process as well. But before I start with my presentation, I would like to ask a few questions to you. Maybe I can see you. Now I think I can see you in the gallery. Who of you works as a facilitator? Maybe raise your hand. Okay, at least a few. Who of you works as a mediator? Who has experience with mediation? Okay, also see a hand. It's great. There's some knowledge already. Who of you is facing conflict situations during facilitation processes? Is it something that comes up in your work as a facilitator? Okay, I also see some hands. And who of you is happy when a conflict arises during his or her facilitation process? Who is really happy about that when that happens? Okay, one person is happy. At least that. Okay, thank you. So yes, of course, we also face conflict in facilitation processes. For me, the main difference between facilitation and mediation is that in a facilitation process, we really focus on improving the cooperation. It's not focusing on a specific conflict. In mediation, we really focus on the conflict. And I feel that in facilitation, when a conflict comes up, it becomes more of a problem in the process. We are actually dealing with other things on the agenda, and the conflict is not really part of the agenda, right? But I also realized that you cannot really ignore a conflict when it comes up in facilitation. On the other hand, mediation is a very structured process, as some of you know, and you cannot really implement it spontaneously into a facilitation process, right? So you cannot integrate a spontaneous mediation session into your facilitation. But what you can do, in my opinion, is to use some of the insights of mediation for your facilitation work. So today I would like to talk about some specific attitudes, approaches, and actions from mediation that I find very helpful when dealing with conflict situation in facilitation processes. And first of all, I would like to talk about attitudes. So our inner posture when a conflict comes up during a facilitation process. I feel that in conflict, we often see people as troublemakers, as problematic, when they are causing some conflict or raising conflict during a facilitation process, especially if the conflict is not on the agenda, right? It's disturbing us, we have other plans, and we are facing some disturbances. One thing I find really important to remember from the mediation perspective is that the people are never the problem. We all know that, but I feel it's really important to remind ourselves of that. The people are never the problem. It's their unsatisfied needs and interests that are not met and that become a problem. That is the first thing I feel is super important from mediation perspective, that I also try to remind myself of every time I'm in a facilitation process. Even though I might not like it, it's not on the agenda, but that people are not the problem. Another tricky aspect I feel is that we are all very quick in judging other people and also decide what's wrong with them, right? We all have this instinct. We see someone, we see some conflict, and we immediately have some idea in our head. It's probably that. Also in mediation, there's this attitude of saying no diagnosis, not trying to explain or diagnose a conflict for other people. It's not really helpful. And I feel, especially in facilitation processes where you have less time for it, it's very important to refrain yourself from trying a diagnose about the conflict or giving some advice. Another attitude I find helpful is that as mediators, we are not neutral. We are an all-party support. For me, it's a big difference. Neutral, for example, a referee in a football game, he doesn't really care about anyone, he cares about the rules. A coach or a trainer of a team cares about everyone. It's a difference of supporting no one or everyone. And in mediation, it's very important to remind ourselves that we are not neutral, but we are an all-party support. And I feel the same is true in the facilitation process. A practical tip I like a lot is to say, like me to yourself. And I don't mean in the sense that people should like you, but more in the sense of a reminder that you are also like that. Someone who is disappointed, for example, you can remind yourself, me too sometimes am disappointed for some reasons. A person who is angry, remind yourself, say to yourself, like me, sometimes this person is angry. And this helps create a connection. I think it's a very important basis for all further approaches or actions that you take when a conflict arises in facilitation. Let me come to some approaches. In mediation, a very important approach, an inspiration that I find very useful is Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy. Some of you might know this. So the idea is, how, now that you have a specific attitude, how do you approach a conflict during a facilitation? And I see three things of Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy as very useful: empathy, acceptance, and authenticity. Empathy means to feel the other person's world as if it was your own. It doesn't mean to encourage the other person in its perspective, in its position, in its ideas. It's just to try to feel the other person's world as if it was your own, and try to verbalize that. The second thing is the acceptance, of trying to fully accept, at least in this very moment, the other person with his views, his or her views, opinions, character, personality, whatever it is. At least for this moment, fully accept that person completely. Again, it doesn't mean to agree with this person, but to accept the person. And the third part, which I find very useful also as a facilitator, is to remain authentic, to not become some kind of unemotional robot when you don't feel good in a specific situation, but to be able to still remain yourself in this empathetic and accepting position that you have. And because it's all very theoretical, I would just like to invite you to a little experiment. Maybe you can imagine a person that you strongly dislike, or at least that you have a strong disagreement with. I'm sure you'll find someone in your head. And maybe just for a second, try to create full empathy for this person's perspectives, for his or her views, for personality, whoever it is. It can be hard, but I think it's really worth training. Maybe you can also try, if you imagine the last time you faced this person, to fully accept this person with his or her behavior in this very moment. In real life, it's even harder, but it's also something I feel very worth training. And the third part would be to imagine, what words would you use to verbalize that empathy, to verbalize that acceptance, and still remain yourself? Because it's very important to verbalize the empathy and the acceptance. We sometimes forget we are very empathetic to another person, but we don't say it. So the other person doesn't feel that you're empathetic if you don't say it. You feel it for yourself, you feel for the other person, but without verbalizing it, without verbalizing the acceptance, the other person will not know that you accept the other person, that you're empathetic. That was a very short little experiment. And now you might ask yourself, what are concrete actions that you can take? So what can you concretely do when a conflict arises in your facilitation process? As I said in the beginning, I acknowledge that there is not so much time in the facilitation process to completely resolve a conflict. You don't have 3 extra hours to do a complete detour and start with a completely new topic if you have a clear agenda. And it's very useful to remind yourself that you should not try to solve any conflict in a facilitation process, but you should not ignore the conflict either. And for me, the middle way between these two is paraphrasing. I know that most of you know what paraphrasing is. I still would like to give a little reminder. Paraphrasing basically has 3 steps: the listening part, the reformulating part, and the check. In mediation, what is very important is not to listen for too long, because if you listen to a person for too long, you will not be able to remember everything the person said to reformulate it. So it's actually very useful for the other person to be interrupted, to interrupt the other person, to reformulate and ask if you understood it correctly. Let me give you 3 examples of concrete moments where you can use paraphrasing in a facilitation session. The first is to paraphrase accusations into open-ended topics. So imagine you are in a facilitation process, a conflict comes up, and one of the statements, let's say of a team leader to an employee is, "You are always late," in whatever the words the person uses. This could be paraphrased into an open-ended topic of office hours. You would say, "I understood that you have an issue, you have a topic that you want to discuss, which is about the office hours. Is that correct?" And then the person can say if that's the topic or not. Another very useful way to use paraphrasing is to paraphrase positions into interests. So again, imagine a conflict comes up. One employee says to the other, "You must change." Very often. Another person has to do, "It's not me," another person has to do something. That's the problem. That's the conflict. Here you could paraphrase it. You could say, "I understood that for you specifically, security is important. You need security in your work to plan your meetings or whatever it is. Is that correct?" And it doesn't have to be correct. If it's not correct, it gives the other person, again, an opportunity to clarify exactly what the person means. I feel that this is very important because it changes the communication from you statements, you must do something, into me statements. You must change is very hard to accept for the other person. I need security is understandable for others as well. The same goes for the principle, for the example I just mentioned before. It de-escalates because making a topic out of an accusation makes it impersonal. Office hours as a topic is impersonal. You are always late is very personal. So the paraphrasing very quickly with really 1 or 2 sentences de-escalates a conflict. The accuser, the person who says you're always late, feels understood, and the accused feels less attacked because you turn it from an accusation to an open-ended topic. And the third technique that you can use paraphrasing for is the mutual intervention. I also find it very useful in facilitation processes. So after you paraphrased person A and person B, you summarize what you heard from both sides, both the differences and the agreements. So for example, this would be like, I understood that for both of you, the topic of the office hours is relevant. I understood that for you, security is very important, and that for you, flexibility is something that you really care about. Is that correct? Again, you can do that very quickly, and what I find very nice about this is that you move from this either-or picture, where 2 people have seemingly incompatible interests, to kind of a picture where both people can fit in and have their place. And with this mutual intervention, this works really fast. It doesn't take a lot of time to do that. So let me quickly summarize what we were looking at. First, it was about the attitude. To say, like me, even though you face seemingly problematic people. I feel that is the essential basis for any further approaches or actions in a conflict. Then we looked at some specific approaches from Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy, specifically on empathy, acceptance, and authenticity. That is, feeling the other person's world as if it was your own. Fully accepting this person in this very moment, while still trying to take care to remain yourself and not pretend to be some unemotional robot. It's very hard, but I feel that these approaches are very important in any kind of discussion or dialogue, whether it's in conflict or not, actually. And then we looked at some specific actions that you can take, specifically about paraphrasing. Paraphrasing accusations into topics, that is, turning from you are always late to office hours. Turning positions into interests, that is, from you must change to I need security. And we looked at the mutual intervention, that is to summarize both the agreements and the disagreements, to show that both parties are legitimate in their interest and that they can coexist. Of course, during a facilitation process, you often don't have the time to fully resolve the conflicts instantly. But what is important to me to say in this context is that you always have the possibility to acknowledge the conflict and reframe it in order to return to a setting where facilitation is possible again, because that is what you need in the facilitation process. You need a basis where you can work with the people again. It's way too much asked to resolve the conflict, but the acknowledgement of the conflict is important, I believe. For the resolution of the conflict itself, I think that it's best to source it out of the facilitation process, either to a responsible HR personnel, or if you're a mediator yourself, propose a different setting or contact a professional mediator that you trust. So for me, really, it's neither ignoring the conflict nor resolving the conflict, but acknowledge the conflict to make free space again for the cooperation process to continue. I hope that this little input from a mediation perspective was useful for you, and that it helps you better deal with conflicts in your facilitation processes. Of course, if you have further questions, you are very welcome to contact me, and I would also be happy to connect with you on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Twitter. Thank you very much for your attention.
Paul, this was perfect. I think it's very useful and interesting approach for our facilitation world. And we should be in contact for, perhaps we can ask you to join one of our weekly sessions to help us more. It's I don't know what the coaches felt, but I'm really interested to hear from you more.
Would be a pleasure to me. Thank you again.
That's very kind of you, and thank you very much for your time and joining us here today. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Thanks a lot.